Well, what if I ask you a big picture question that's also like an origins question? Like, we've talked quite a bit, and probably a lot of people have heard the story of how you were at the concert, you were young, and you looked out over the bluffs, and that's how you started getting into the catastrophic geology.
It's
But
true.
what about your origin? Like, how did you start getting into the symbolism and the esoteric stuff that you talk about? Why don't you tell some of that story?
Am I allowed to talk
Sorry.
about peyote?
Absolutely.
Yes. That was probably a contributing factor at one point.
I mean, did
um,
you travel to India and spend 15 years in a monastery? Like, how did this work? What happened?
no, I didn't do that. Although I did study with a Brahmin priest for a couple of years, learning about, Hindu symbolism. And that was kind of an outgrowth of, a lot of the things that happened. And I also studied with the Himalayan Swami, sort of along with the Brahmin priest. And so I got very much into the Hindu approach to symbolism. And that was probably where I first immersed myself into that area of interest. Although, even as a kid, I was really, really interested in mythology. And there wasn't a whole lot available to me, but I just really absorbed a lot of Greek and Scandinavian mythology. So I was reading all the stories about Zeus and Hera and all the rest of the pantheon of gods. And then I also got into the Norse mythology, the story of Ragnarok, and Hercules and Woden and all of that. So I think that probably was a contributing factor, and that was something I think I got into in maybe fourth or fifth grade. Started reading books on those subjects, and I vaguely remember reading in a Greek myth about, probably was, I don't know if it was Bullfinch or Edith Hamilton or maybe like a kid's version of one of those, but, the story of Phaeton. And of course, I really at that point made no connection in my mind with Phaeton being an actual astronomical event, or Ragnarok, the Midgard serpent encircling the earth, the images, the wars of the gods and all of that, which I just found really strange in a way, kind of almost in some ways disturbing, but still very compelling and fascinating. So I would say that, that's the first place in my life where I can remember kind of being attracted to those kinds of things. My teenage years, not so much, although I did read quite a bit of science fiction, got into a lot of the stuff that now I think is called steampunk, right?
Ah,
You've heard of that, right?
yeah, I have.
Well, I
Steampunk.
was kind of like into steampunk decades before there was a steampunk, getting really into, Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle and
Okay.
H.G. Wells
Yeah.
and all of that stuff, late Victorian, early Edwardian period from, 1880s up to really, I guess, like the First World War in that interim when all of that kind of stuff was going on. And, the Industrial Revolution was going full tilt. And, that's when you begin to get a lot of people, social commentators looking at what's going on and trying to project into the future, where all these changes are going to be leading. So we're just really getting into, things like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The Invisible Man and The Lost World. And
Did you read Arthur C. Clarke or Larry
later,
Niven?
oh yeah,
Yeah, later.
later, I
Yeah,
read Arthur C. Clarke.
he's got a lot of famous ones.
Yeah, he does have a lot of famous ones. But yeah, a lot of those I was really a huge Ray
Ray
Bradbury
Bradbury.
fan.
Okay.
Yeah, I loved Ray Bradbury. I probably read everything written by Ray Bradbury. But, all of that was kind of leading up to, the late 60s and all the stuff that came down then. And, the realization that there's more to reality and existence than what meets the eye. So that's kind of what led me, I kind of followed, a lot of the same path. The Beatles go to India, right? And they learn meditation from the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And so I didn't go to India. My younger brother Rowan went to India with the Swami, but I wanted to find out what all, meditation was all about and, looking into the fact that there might have been higher realms of consciousness. So that was a big part of what came off that psychedelic era, was looking for verification that what, we had experienced, what I had experienced, had some objective basis outside of my own subjective experience. And so going into a lot of the traditions that had come down to us, mostly initially it was my exposure to Eastern spiritual traditions that led me to that. But in that regard, I was somewhat fortunate that I had easy access to some of these, like the Dr. Arya. He was the Brahmin priest that I first studied with and started learning meditation and learning Hindu rituals. So I have, photographs of us up in the North Woods of Minnesota, and he's performing, Hindu rituals. And I don't remember a lot of the specifics actually about it, other than that was probably my first really introduction to the idea that symbolism was a core part of some of the great world's religions. And then from there, I kind of circled back to Christianity and took a fresh look at Christianity and realized that there was a whole corpus of symbolism there that actually had its roots in much earlier traditions. Made its way into Christianity, was basically a repackaging of, yet it wasn't it was a repackaging that I think added additional value in depths of meaning to a lot of that earlier symbolism. The prominent idea being, for example, the death and resurrection of the divine king that goes back to the Osirian mysteries of Egypt and others, many of the various heroes and gods that were slain and then rose again from the dead in some form or another. The realization that most of the Christian symbolism had these earlier roots, which to me didn't invalidate the symbolism of Christianity. It only made it that much deeper and richer. Yeah, but I would say specifically then looking into the underlying meanings between, associated with traditional religions, for example, with Christianity and Judaism, or at least, what we would call the Judeo-Christian tradition, the realization that there was a whole system of symbolism and deeper meaning associated with that in the form of the Kabbalah. And you have heard of the Kabbalah, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And that was a major discovery for me.
How would you describe it? Like, for anybody who maybe hasn't heard of it, what would you say? Like, can you give a brief description?
It means, Kabbalah essentially means to reveal, or it's like the revelation of the inner core, the inner tradition. And it's based, a lot of it is mathematically based, which I found really interesting because I was always drawn to mathematical thinking and left brain type of stuff. And then to find out that, for me, I guess the really, really compelling thing that I learned was about the structure of the Semitic language and the structure of the Semitic alphabet, that, for example, the Hebrew alphabet and the Greek alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet of the Old Testament, the Greek alphabet of the New Testament were numerical.
Right. So that's Gematria.
Yeah, that's Gematria.
Okay.
I've heard it pronounced both with a hard G, Gematria, and with a soft Gematria. And I don't necessarily know which is the correct one, because I've heard it both ways. So the basic idea is that the names, the words, and the phrases in these texts, the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament, could be also translated by means of their numerical equivalents. And so, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Chef, Vav, Zain, Het, Tet, Yud, Kaf, Mem, Nun, Samak, Ayin, Pei. The Hebrew alphabet has numerical values. Aleph 1, Bet 2, Gimel 3, Dalet 4, Che 5, Het, whatever. So I just said it. But anyways, so you go through by units, that gets you to 10, which is the Yud. We kind of already met the Yud, right? Where did we meet the Yud, right? Wasn't it on the tarot card we looked at?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the sky. There's like a bunch of them in the sky. Like
there's a bunch of Yuds in the sky, yeah.
That are like dripping off the flaming torch or something.
Yeah. So the Yud is kind of like symbolically the seed of the Hebrew alphabet. And if you look at the actual structure of the Hebrew alphabet, you'll see that all of the letters are various permutations of the basic Yud. It's stretched, it's replicated, and then connected in different ways. But you'll see that very clearly, and it has to do with the way that the letters of the alphabet were actually drawn, like with a flat quill pen. If I knew we were going to talk about this, I would have been set up, and I could have demonstrated drawing a few Hebrew letters. But so the idea is you've got numbers. And it's the same with the Greek. You can look at the Greek numbers and the Greek letters, and you'll have alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, so on, right through the alphabet. And you'll have units, and you get to the value of 10. In the Greek, the iota, the letter iota has the value of 10. And then you can go to kappa, lambda. So you've got 20, 30, mu, nun. So you've got 40, 50. So it goes by units, tens, and then hundreds, right? So what that implies is that you can take words, names, and phrases, substitute in the numerical values of the letters, add them up, and you'll get into a number, say, for a name or a particular word or a phrase. And then the next thing is, does that number have a significance or a meaning, aside from just being a random number that's generated? And therein we get into the gematria, which is one of the core techniques, you would say, of the Kabbalistic system, is this substitution cipher that then leads into the realm of numbers. Well, then you go from the realm of numbers to the realm of geometry, because what you discover is that there's a high correlation between the relationship of the numerical values of words, names, and phrases and particular geometric forms. So that to me is where it really gets interesting. So at some point we can do a whole presentation on this, and I'll have examples and graphs and how the particular geometric forms that come out of it now become the basis for if you will, a type of sacred architecture. And it's all interconnected. So systems of metrology and measurement will have numerical ratios. And you find it both in natural, but in also human-made art and architecture, particular geometric ratios. And those ratios recur redundantly in some of these scriptural writings when you translate them numerically. Well, yeah, I mean, Kabbalah is a very multidimensional area of study, and there's a lot to it. I mean, I've probably read 6 or 8 books on Kabbalah, and yeah, it's a system of meditation. I kind of look at the gematria as almost being kind of it's almost cone-like if you've studied Zen and you know what a cone is. It's a paradox you're confronted with that you have to try to reconcile the contradictory nature in your mind, and the reconciliation of this contradictory nature of the cone is sort of what leads to the awakening or the realization. Basically, it was the cipher dimension of Kabbalah that mostly commanded my attention. So basically, I spent a fair amount of time, particularly in the 70s and early 80s, going through line by line through, procuring copies of the reconstructed Hebrew and the reconstructed Greek, interlinear, which I have on my shelf in the other room, and working out numerical values of words, names, and phrases. And then there wasn't a whole lot of literature on it, but I did find some. The work of Bly Bond and William Simcox Lee, very interesting stuff. Bly Bond was an ecclesiastical architect who did the initial excavations and archaeological exploration at the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey in England. He used some rather unorthodox methods to help him in his attempts to find where to dig, for example, looking for specific remnants of the original structures and so on. And when the church authorities found out about that, he was quickly dismissed from his post. But he collaborated with Reverend William Simcox Lee, and they did some of the very early work on Kabbalistic interpretation of scriptures. Also, the work of William Sterling, who was the late 19th century, did a book. The title of it escapes me for the moment, but he delved deeply into some of the meanings, the numerical and mathematical, the geometry behind the outer literal form. So you could kind of think of it that way. In this context, you look at the stories and the allegories and things that are being presented, and those are the literary outer forms. The Garden of Eden, the serpent in the garden, for example, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, the tree of life. All of these things are kind of literal symbols. But then when you translate them numerically, you discover that there is this pattern of number that is associated. Once you get that, then you can begin to look for correlations. Now, what Bly Bond and William Simcox Lee did was they explored the geometric correlations that emerged. So that was a major discovery for me. And then the work of Frater Achad, who was a member of several occult orders in the early 20th century, wrote several books on Kabbalah, from sort of the, occult perspective. One of them in particular I found extremely fascinating was called The Anatomy of the Body of God. And he went into a detailed geometric construction of the symbol of the tree of life. And I think he came upon something quite profound. And so I immersed myself in that study, and this the symbol of the tree of life itself, which is fundamental to the Kabbalah. So there was that. And then just, circling back to mythology, and now expanding my purview of mythology from Greek and Norse mythology into a lot of other realms of mythology, and of course I encountered the Vedas with my studies with the Brahmin priest and immersing myself into the whole, the whole yoga philosophy and that tradition. So I became very interested in the Vedas, read the Mahabharata, I read the Upanishads, a lot of those things. And again, what I began to see was the parallels, between the different traditions. And I go, okay, this is interesting. How many other traditions from around the world have these kind of parallels? So, I began to look at, Polynesian mythology, Native American mythology, African mythology, Chinese mythology, read compendiums of books, and all of this is, mid 70s. And what struck me was, the parallels, the overlaps between these stories. And of course, I got really intrigued by the fact that so many of these accounts all had stories of, had an apocalyptic element to them. And, obviously the apocalyptic element is very prominent in the Norse mythology, very prominent. I mean, and so that played a huge role in, the wars of the gods and the giants, those kinds of things, and the battles in the sky. And then, of course, the consistency of the flood myths, I found very curious, because I didn't know that. I didn't know that there was a story of the flood, great flood, outside of the Bible. I didn't really know that till later on. And then,
there's hundreds of them, right? I mean, they found flood myths.
Yeah, they're from all over the world.
Yeah.
And there's been various attempts to explain that away, but I find them extremely unconvincing.
Richard wants to know if one day you'll tell us more about the moon, which I know that is coming up someday, right?
Yeah, well, you know what? Brad and I are going to be shortly doing a short little intro to kind of stimulate interest in that. And what I'm going to do is, it's going to be a progressive disclosure.
Excellent.
Rather than all at once, just because I don't want to be responsible for the consequences. I don't want, trauma centers being overloaded, mental hospitals suddenly having to turn people away. I don't want to be responsible for any of that. So,
right. No, too much lunacy.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly it. We have to dispense lunacy in measured doses. So the answer is, to who asked that question?
Was it Richard? Sorry, these scrolling by so fast. Let me check. Yes, Richard.
Richard, yes. Richard, the answer to your question is yes, my friend, we will. And Brad and I actually have a little appetizer we're going to be sharing soon.
Yeah.
You were getting into more details. Randall, you were trying to track something down to have a better definition of what was that? What was that 3-word term? You were
getting some inside baseball here.
The propagation of waves through a material. What was that called?
Ooh. Oh, seismic velocity.
Was that the one?
I think so.
Okay.
When we start looking at the velocity of seismic waves as propagated through various materials, for example, the kind of materials composing the crust of the moon. Yeah, that's
seismic
exactly
velocity.
But
hint.
Well, let's go back to where you were. You said you were looking at, basically you're doing comparative mythology from myths around the world. And it struck you how many of them had apocalyptic stories and flood stories. Yes.
So I remember it would have been 1972, living in the north woods of Minnesota, just north above Brainerd, Minnesota. we bought some land and we're living in a half-built kind of garage. I remember it was colder than shit out there. And I'm huddling, probably had a blanket on, and I'm huddling under a little lamp, and I'm reading the book of the Hopi by Frank Waters. And he gets into the four Hopi worlds and the four destructions. Now, I was familiar with the four ages of the world from reading the Greek stuff. So I'm going, oh, how interesting. No, the Hopis had this. And, then it was talking about each of the successive worlds just being destroyed by some kind of a catastrophe, a great hurricane, a fire, a flood, etc. And I just remember sitting there late at night reading that. It's quiet, it's just up in the woods. It's in the winter. It's cold out. So, if you've ever been in, anybody living up at that kind of latitude up close to the 49th parallel, that some of those winter nights, they can be clear, cold, and very, very quiet, and it was that kind of a night. And I just remember sitting there thinking, well, that was probably didn't come out of they didn't just make this up. There must have been really things that happened. I just remember having that kind of instinct about it, and so I set out to try to understand whether or not there was a real geological basis to some of these things. And as I got into it, I would say that by 1980, after 7 or 8 years of further study and research and so on, I definitely was convinced that, yeah, absolutely, there was a real geological basis to this idea of cyclical catastrophes. In that interim, I discovered Hamlet's Mill, which really laid out the template for the great year based upon a precessional cycle. And I read, again, Vedic traditions. I found the work of Sri Aurobindo, which I read, who talked about cycles, and some of his followers and stuff wrote about cycles. And that became a matter of great interest to me. So I'd say most of the 70s, I was exploring, symbolism. I was exploring various spiritual traditions, mythology, kind of what you would call occult traditions, because I went from looking at the Eastern stuff over to more looking at the Western esoteric tradition, and then realized that there was this incredibly rich Western esoteric tradition that I had been completely unaware of in my youth. And so all of the stories, the legends, the myths and everything were all actually had their roots in that esoteric tradition. So, it's just kind of an ongoing process. I would say that it was around late 70s when I really began to dive into some of the catastrophist stuff. I think I discovered Charles Hapgood's work in 1978, maybe read Velikovsky in 1975, 76, right in there. Of course, the thing that I found most compelling was Earth in Upheaval, which I think is the one book he wrote that really stood the test of time. His other works, Ages in Chaos and others, where he attempts, in Earth in Upheaval, what he did was he gathered together a lot of information and traditions about from geology, from mythology, from psychology, drawing all of these threads together to make the claim that there really had been tremendous catastrophes in the history of planet Earth. Then in his subsequent books, he tried to explain what could have triggered those catastrophes. And that's most of the critics that attacked him were on that basis of his subsequent astrophysics, not so much his compilation that appeared in Earth in Upheaval. That has pretty much stood the test of time, because what he did was he just basically collected all of those loose strands out there from all of these different realms, first, in the 1950s. And then I think Charles Hapgood kind of followed in the Velikovskyan footsteps. He surmised that it was a pole shift. Velikovsky talked about pole shifts, but in his model, it was the entire mass of the Earth that shifted. Whereas, interestingly, Hapgood came up with his model of accelerated plate tectonics and was really developing that idea at the same time continental drift was actually becoming an accepted paradigm within geology, because prior to the 70s, it was considered fringe. It only began to get marginally accepted in the 60s, and then finally grafted into mainstream geological thinking in the 70s. Well, basically what that said was that the crust of the earth, the plates of the earth moved, moved laterally over the underlying mantle, right? So up to that time, the earth was mostly seen, with the exception, of course, Wegener in his school, who was the basically the first ones historically that's recognized as theorizing that the plates of the earth, of the crustal plates of the earth, moved. And of course, that was based upon simple observation that if you move the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, against Europe and Africa, they kind of fit together like pieces of a puzzle, right? That was Wegener's insight, really. Well, so Hapgood, what he did was he theorized that there was this crustal displacement that took place. And it was the crustal displacement that happened orders of magnitude faster than the continental drift guys were imagining. But it was this crustal displacement that caused the catastrophes. Now, in his book, Path of the Pole, which I think I actually found it at a used book sale, library book sale, for like $1 or something, the hardback version, which I still have. I read that, became totally convinced that great catastrophes were real. And then he had a very extensive bibliography in the back of the book. And what I did was I systematically started going through that. And I started going to haunting university libraries and looking up a lot of the stuff that he referenced that was available in old journals and things, old geological journals and, journals of ethnography or whatever it might have been, and studying that stuff. And so that convinced me that I really wanted to, for one thing, I wanted to really learn more geology. So around 79 or 80, because I'm looking at this, I'm going, well, wait a second now. Here's these guys like Velikovsky and Hapgood and others talking about these great geological catastrophes that caused mass extinctions and the collapse of civilizations. But I've never seen anything like that referenced, within my limited framework of awareness of geological orthodoxy at that time. I don't remember, everything was one grain of sand, one drop of water at a time. Over millions of years, this was over and over again. This was over millions of years. This happens, that happens. And in that model of change, you don't even notice anything hardly over a lifespan, a human lifespan, because it all takes tens, hundreds, thousands, and millions of years for changes to accumulate incrementally. But so you had these two totally different ways of looking at the world, the gradualist model and the catastrophist model. So in my mind, I'm trying to reconcile that. And that's what really led me into, okay, I've got these references here. Let me go and track these down. So I mainly go back to these old editions of the Geological Society of America Bulletin and so on, and looking this stuff up. And I'm going, well, yeah, this, yeah. It does seem like in this, nobody's explicitly saying catastrophism, but what's implicit here is catastrophes. So that
let me stop you there before I lose track.